Thanks. So good afternoon, everyone. Before I give the floor to Francisco in order to introduce our speaker for today, I would like to thank Silvia Locatelli to agree to participate at the HPhil seminar. Silvia Locatelli is a member of Praxis Group, and it is our honor to have members of all three groups participating in this seminar when they have some research within history of philosophy. This was actually something that the Portuguese Foundation for Science and Technology advised us to do often, and this is actually our practice, and so we're happy to have you here. Now I'll give the floor to Francisco to introduce you.
Thank you. So we have with us Silvia Locatelli. She's a member of Praxis and a PhD student in philosophy, in co-tutel with between the University of Padua and the University of Lisbon. Her research focuses on Hegel's philosophy, UK Irigaray, sexual difference, and feminist interpretations of German idealism. She also spent research and study periods in Münster, Lancaster, Milan, New York, Stony Brook University, Bochum, Hegel Archive, Valencia, and Santiago, Chile. She's a member of the research group in classical German philosophy. Among her recent publications, we have How Should Nature Be Studied Philosophically? A Hegelian Response, Hegel's Antigone, Sittlichkeit as a Concrete Universal, Hegel and the Speculative Ontology of Nature. Okay, so the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here, so I can even share some of the research topics that have interested me lately, the last 4 years actually. And so I'm going to start reading my presentation, and I have a PowerPoint where we have the various quotes that I will read. So in this presentation, I will discuss part of my doctoral research on sexual difference in Hegel. The main aim is to situate historically Hegel's reflections on the distinction between the male and the female sexes. In order to do so, it is first necessary to clarify how sexual difference is conceptualized within Hegel's philosophical system itself. And Hegel's system is divided in 3 parts: logic, nature, and spirit. So we will address all these 3 parts. Only on this basis can we then show how Hegel moves, I think, ambiguously between 2 different sex models, the one-sex model and the two-sex model. And this is in line with the historical moment to which he belongs, a moment that can be understood as a transition from the former to the latter. For this reason, my presentation, I have divided it in 2 main parts. So in the first, I examine how the concept of sexual difference unfolds within Hegel's philosophical system, with particular attention to its development in the science of logic, in the philosophy of nature, and in the philosophy of spirit. The aim here is to articulate the systematic role and significance of sexual difference in Hegel's thoughts by analyzing the moment of the logical genus, so in the logic, the natural genus process in nature, and the family in the sphere of spirit. I see all these 3 processes as parallel, one with the other, but I will tell something more later. So in the second part, I assess the historical significance of Hegel's treatment of sexual difference, drawing on Thomas Laqueur's distinction between the one-sex and the two-sex models. I argue that Hegel's time represents a moment of paradigm transition. In brief, then I will talk about this extensively, but for now I can tell you what is in brief the one-sex and the two-sex model. So the one-sex model assumes that there is fundamentally only one fully realized sex, the male, while the female is understood as its incomplete or inferior counterpart. By contrast, the two-sex model conceives male and female as radically distinct. While Thomas Laqueur focuses primarily on identifying these 2 models, he pays less attention to the ambiguity of the transition itself between the 2. I take Hegel, not Hegel alone, a lot of his contemporaries are situated precisely within this transitional moment. Other contemporaries of Hegel that are transitioning between the one-sex model and the two-sex model are, for example, Schelling, von Hocken, Carus, and Görres. So before starting, a terminological clarification is necessary. Why? Because I have chosen to speak of sexual difference rather than sex difference or gender difference. Clearly, in Hegel's time, the distinction between sex and gender has not yet been dematized, but nowadays it's really important in the feminist debate. And today, this distinction can be summarized as follows. On the one hand, sex difference has to do with biological characteristics such as chromosomes, hormones, and reproductive anatomy, something generally considered as fixed and immutable. On the other hand, gender refers to socially and culturally constructed roles and expressions associated with being male and female, and thus to something mutable, something that can change in relation, for example, to our culture or to the historical period. At this point, I propose to use a third term alongside sex and gender, namely sexual difference. And this is a term especially important and dear to Lucy Garay. I adopted this term because Hegel's conception of the sexes cannot be adequately understood either as a purely biological difference, that is, sex, or as a merely socio-cultural construction, that is, gender. Rather, in my view, it operates at the symbolic level. So when we talk about sexual difference, we are talking about the symbolic level, that is, at the level of the meanings and values through which we interpret and experience our sexed bodies. As Alison Stone puts it, speaking of sexual difference means recognizing that, and here I quote, as human beings, we always live and experience our bodies as imbued with meaning, never as bare biological being. End of the quote. Now, an example could be useful to be more familiar with what is the symbolic sexual difference. So, for instance, the female reproductive organs are often not understood only in anatomical terms, but symbolically interpreted as passive or receptive, in contrast to the supposedly active male organs. So, these associations do not simply follow from biological facts, nor are they reducible to changing social roles. So they are not about sex, they are not about gender. Rather, they reflect a symbolic framework through which sexual embodiment is perceived, interpreted, and lived. So I will analyze some associations that Hegel makes. On the one side, for example, of woman with nature, passivity, and unity, and on the other side of man with spirit, activity, and differentiation, which so are therefore not neutral descriptions, but symbolically charged determinations. So we go with the first part. The central thesis of the first part is that Hegel conceptualizes sexual difference in the system, that is logic, nature, and spirit, in three distinct yet interrelated ways, each of which clarifies the general functioning of the systematic sphere to which it belongs. First, sexual difference appears in a germinal form in the science of logic, the domain in which the idea is presented in its pure and abstract form. Second, it emerges as an opposition in the philosophy of nature, the sphere in which indeed the division and tension between concept and objectivity becomes effective. Finally, it is articulated as what Hegel would call a unity in difference in the philosophy of spirit, where the idea returns to itself by passing through the different external objectivity that is nature. By tracing this trajectory, I aim to show that sexual difference is not a marginal theme in Hegel's philosophy, but a fundamental problem that permeates his logical categorizations, his conception of natural life, and his understanding of spirit. In all the three stages that we analyze, the genus in the logic, the genus process in nature, and the family in spirit, we can see a similar movement. So there is a tension between what Hegel calls particularity and universality. This tension for Hegel in the moment of the genus process, and family is not resolved dialectically through a fully speculative reconciliation. What Hegelian we mean with the dialectical resolution or speculative reconciliation is a formal unity in which the opposite terms, in this case particularity and universality, are not eliminated or forgotten, but are preserved and transformed within a Hegel relation that maintains their difference while integrating them into a dynamic whole. However, on the contrary, in all the three parallel moments of genus, genus process, and family, the tension between particular and universal leads to the suppression or elimination of the particular individual in order for universality to realize itself completely. It is precisely within this failure of the dialectical reconciliation that, from my point of view, sexual difference enters the scene. Indeed, sexual difference functions as the element that makes a total reconciliation between universal of the genus and particular living individual impossible. By dividing the genus into sexually differentiated individuals, indeed it prevents any single individual from fully embodying the universality to which it belongs. But now we will see it in detail. So first, the sense of logic. So Hegel addresses sexual difference within the sense of logic in the moment of the genus, Gattung, which is contained in the logical idea of life. So this is a schema to show how we arrive to sexual difference. We see difference. We start with the book, The Wissenschaft der Logik, that is divided in 3 books. In the third book, The Doctrine of the Concept, we have the idea of life in the third part. Third, the process of the idea of life is this genus process, Gattung, and inside here we find sexual difference. At the logical moment of life, so the idea of life, and especially in the moment of the genus, Hegel seeks to think a dialectical relation between two opposite poles. On the one hand, the universality of the genus, and on the other, the particular living being. At first glance, Hegel seems to suggest that the genus offers a speculative reconciliation of these two moments. In this sense, what happens in the genus process in the first moment? That the particular incorporates the universal, and universal becomes actual in the particular. So there is a dialectical interchange, we can say, between the two elements, where they are not eliminated or forgotten, but they are brought in relation. But it's not that easy. Indeed, Hegel immediately complicates this picture. Already in the opening lines of the section on the idea of life, he indeed writes that the genus involves, and here I quote, the turning back to its concept and the repetition of the first forcible separation, the coming to be of a new individuality and the death of the immediate first. End of the quote. This formulation suggests that the genus cannot establish a fully speculative reconciliation between universal and particular. Rather, the realization of the universal ultimately requires the negation, the annihilation, the death of the particular individual. Why then does this speculative reconciliation not fully occur at the level of the genus? Hegel offers an important clue when he speaks in the sense of logic of the duplication of the individual. This duplication signals that the individual, which should embody the universality of the genus, is instead split and unable to coincide fully with it. A further indication to orient us can be found in paragraph 2020 of the Encyclopedia Logic, that is another version of the science of logic, shorter but with the same topics. And here Hegel explicitly refers to the word Geschlechtsdifferenz, that is the difference of the sexes, sexual difference. From this perspective, the disruption of the particularization of the universal becomes quite clear, since sexual difference introduces a structural division within the genus itself. Indeed, each sex represents only a partial realization of the genus. Belonging to the female sex excludes belonging to the male and vice versa. Sexual individuals are therefore structurally unable to embody the totality of the genus. The speculative reconciliation that the genus promises thus remains incomplete, since the universal cannot be fully actualized in any single sexually determined individual. This is the point at which the tension of the genus emerges. So, on the one hand, the individual should particularize its genus. On the other hand, as a sexed being, it stands in relation to another sexed individual and recognizes that it cannot represent the genus as a whole. For this reason, the individual experiences what Hegel calls the longing to posit this identity and to realize itself as universal. The apparent solution to this tension for Hegel is reproduction, that is, the generation of a third individual through the union of the sexes, what Hegel calls the propagation of the living species. Yet, from the standpoint of the idea, this process fails to resolve the problem. Indeed, reproduction simply generates another sexed individual, therefore repeating the same limitation. For this reason, the genus ultimately culminates in what Hegel calls the realized genus, which consists not in a speculative resolution between particular and universal, but in a triumph of universality over the particular individual, who must perish. Hegel formulates this transition in striking terms. He says that in copulation, the immediacy of living individuality perishes. The death of this life is the coming to be of spirit. What remains is therefore, and here I quote again, a reality which is itself simple universality. So, to conclude with the logic, from this perspective, I argue that sexual difference is already present at the logical level. However, it is present only in a germinal form. This means that it does not yet appear as a clear opposition, as it will be in the philosophy of nature, nor as a unity in difference, as in the philosophy of spirit. This is because, within the logic, thought still unfolds within the sphere of pure thinking, where it deals only with itself, without the creation of sharp oppositions and negations. Indeed, Hegel explains that logic is the science of the pure idea, the idea in the abstract element of thinking. For this reason, here, sexual difference appears only in a preliminary and germinal way. So now we move to the philosophy of nature, where we will see that the same movement repeats, so it will be shorter. So in the third part of the philosophy of nature, Hegel introduces the organism as the natural counterpart of the logical idea of life. Within the organism, we encounter, at the level of nature, a relation between particularity and universality, analogous to the one previously analyzed in the science of logic. However, for the subjectivity of the organism to become fully concrete, says Hegel, organic life must pass through several stages, culminating in the animal organism. So this is the division similar to the one we had in the science of logic. We have the Naturphilosophie, second part of the system, third section, organism, third section of the third section, the animal organism, that Hegel says there is a subjectivity, but okay. And then third, the process, the genus process, Gattungsprozess. And here in the second process, at least if we see the second edition of the encyclopedia, we find the sexual relation inside the genus process. So it is precisely at this level of the genus that the sexual difference emerges. As in the logical sphere, sexual difference appears within what Hegel calls the process of the genus. Here we find once again the same structural tension already analyzed in the logic. So the attempt to mediate between universality of genus and particularity of individual. Universality, says Hegel, must posit itself as a subjective universality. That is, it must negate the abstract universality and the immediate particularity. Okay, yet in nature, like in the logical moment of the genus, this mediation does not succeed. The reconciliation between universal and particular remains incomplete. And this is exactly because sexual difference makes it impossible for the particular individual to embrace the totality of the genus. Thus, the genus process culminates not in a speculative unity, but in the constant act of reproduction, like in the logic, and in the perishing of the sexed individual, like in the logic. As Hegel states, in this process of the genus, the merely natural being only perishes, for as such, it does not transcend the natural. End of the quote. So this was what happened in the logic. What is new here is that Hegel talks directly about in what does in what consists this sexual difference. So Hegel here presents the relation between the sexes in nature as a strong opposition. He writes that, and here I quote, in the female, it is necessarily the passive moment, das Indifferente. In the male, the moment of duality, das Zweite, of opposition, end of the quote. So on the one side stands the woman, who receives the seeds and undergoes pregnancy, immediately recognizing herself in her offspring. So we can move in the anthropology for a moment of Hegel, that is in the subjective spirit. Here, Hegel emphasizes the connection between feminine and immediacy in a striking way, I think. He talks about the mother, who is described as the genius of the child, since they are, he says, two individuals, yet still in undivided soul unity, end of the quote. This constitutes what Hegel calls the magic relationship, which he associates with the feminine sphere. On the other side, we have the man, who mediates his relation to his offspring. This mediation is already evident in the reproductive act itself, since ejaculation establishes a distance, says Hegel, between the male and his progeny. Hegel, other quotes, these are from the Zusatz and from the Vorlesungen from Hegel, therefore writes that, quote, the male is the active principle and the female is the receptive because she remains in her undeveloped unity, end of the quote. He further reinforces the symbolic association of woman with nature and matter and of man with spirit and subjectivity, stating that, quote, the female contains the material element, but the male contains the subjectivity, end of the quote. So, concluding with nature. In the philosophy of nature, sexual difference appears as a clear opposition between the sexes. This opposition reflects the fundamental character of nature, and because nature, as the second part of the system, is the systematic sphere of tension and division. So in nature, says Hegel, the idea is unable to fully return to itself and therefore manifests itself only as externality. In other words, this means that the essential feature of nature consists in the incapacity of the concept or the idea to fully penetrate natural reality. Nature is therefore characterized by a persistent and unresolved opposition between idea, concept, and objectivity, reality, realität. An opposition that, from my point of view, finds one of its most evident expressions in sexual difference. So now we move to the philosophy of spirit. In the sphere of spirit, sexual difference appears primarily in the moment of the family, which is situated within ethical life, Sittlichkeit. Ethical life can be understood, in general terms, as the counterpart of the logical idea of life and of the natural animal organism. What does it mean? It means that in ethical life is described by Hegel as an organic political structure in which, once again, we find a speculative relation between particularity, in this case, the particular freedom of the citizens, and universality, the universal freedom embodied in social institutions. Here, the schema again. So we are in the third part of the system, the Geistphilosophie, philosophy of spirit. Second part this time, the objective spirit. And third part, that is the ethical life, Sittlichkeit. First part, so the most natural one, that is the family. And here we find sexual difference, especially in the moment of marriage, that for Hegel must be between a man and a woman. So, inside ethical life, we encounter the family. Hegel states that the family corresponds, quote, to the genus, the sexual relationship, but elevated to a spiritual determination, end of the quote. The family thus represents, at the level of spirit, the genus and the process of the genus, so what we find in logic and in nature. As in the previous systematic spheres of the genus, in the family, the universal tends to absorb and eliminate the particular, instead of creating a speculative relation with it. In this sense, in the family, individuals relinquish their immediate individuality and become members, says Hegel, so not person, of a higher ethical unity. Indeed, within the family, the person is present, not really the person, the individual is present, quote, not as an independent person, ein Person für sich, but as a member. The German word is Mitglieder. So, in this sense, the same tension already observed between universal and particular reappears. The speculative reconciliation promised by the concept seems instead to result in the subordination of individuality or particularity to a higher ethical world. Within the family, however, the institution of marriage introduces a more complex configuration of sexual difference. And this is in line with what Hegel says, that the spirit is not simply the translation of what we find in nature. Things are way more complicated there. And we can see this in sexual difference, I think. So, marriage, I argue, represents the moment in which the tension inherent in sexual difference is articulated as, and this is a really Hegelian terminology, unity in difference. Hegel emphasizes how does it happen in this way? So Hegel emphasizes that marriage contains both a natural and a spiritual dimension. The natural dimension consists in the necessity that marriage be contracted between two different sexes. Why? Because for Hegel, marriage is, as at its end, reproduction. The spiritual dimension, by contrast, concern the transformation of this natural relation into higher ethical unity, grounded in what Hegel calls self-conscious love. Thus, sexual difference is at once preserved and mediated. So it remains as a necessary condition for the marriage relation, because we need a man and a woman for Hegel, yet it is simultaneously sublated within a higher spiritual unity. So this unity in difference is reflected more broadly, not just in marriage, but in the whole structure of ethical life, which is composed of three moments for Hegel: family, so private, civil society, public, and state. Woman, and this is quite a sad and well criticized assumption from Hegel, woman whose ethical disposition is grounded for Hegel in the immediacy of familial love, finds her primary actuality within the family. Man, by contrast, is considered capable of mediating himself with the external world, and thus enters civil society. So woman, private sphere, man, public sphere. And this is a real famous Hegelian quote, really rightfully criticized. Man, therefore, has his actual substantial life in the state, in learning, Wissenschaft, and otherwise in work and struggle with the external world and with himself. Woman, however, has her substantial vocation, Bestimmung, in the family, and their ethical disposition consists in this family piety. End of the quote. Although Hegel presents these differentiated roles between man and woman as reconciled within the higher unity of ethical life, this reconciliation does not necessarily imply the overcoming of sexual difference. Rather, difference is maintained, such as women participate to private life and men to civil life, but at the same time reconciled in a higher spiritual unity, the common ethical life. Thus, this is the figure, the political figure of the unity in difference. So, to conclude with spirit, more generally, as in the previous systematic spheres, sexual difference in the philosophy of spirit must be understood within the broader dialectic of spirit. Spirit is the third part of the system, and here what happens? Spirit returns to itself only by passing through what is external and different to it, namely nature. So, spirit is a return from nature, zurückkommen aus der Natur, says Hegel, and this return produces a mediated unity, that is, a unity that exists through difference. In this sense, sexual difference reflects the very structure of spirit. Indeed, the unity of the ethical community is not achieved by eliminating difference, especially sexual difference, but by sustaining itself through it and incorporating it in a higher commonality. So now we pass to the second part that is about the one-sex model, the two-sex model. Now we have the tools to deal with this question that maybe is a little bit more interesting. So Thomas Laqueur, in his book Making Sex from the Greeks to Freud, distinguishes between two historical models for understanding sexual difference. The first is the so-called one-sex model, which Laqueur traces back to classical antiquity and associates especially with Aristotle and Galen. It's important to address the fact that in the secondary literature on Aristotle, there are many scholars that are saying that Aristotle does not really belong to a one-sex model, but more to the two-sex model. I'm not an expert, so I'm just bringing Thomas Laqueur interpretation, but there is a debate on this, and it's important to stress this. So this model, which maintained its dominance from classical antiquity until the late 17th century, did not conceptualize the masculine and the feminine as two distinct and incommensurable sexes, each endowed with its own radically different properties. Rather, it envisaged them within a hierarchical continuum, with the masculine occupying the position of the more perfect and fully realized form of the feminine, while the latter was characterized through privation and dependence. A further defining figure of the one-sex model, Laqueur argues, is the absence of any conceptual separation between sex and gender. So, social and cultural roles were taken to follow directly and naturally from biological membership. But not only that, because Laqueur is really interested in the question of gender, and indeed Laqueur presses this point further, contending that in the one-sex model, it is the social and cultural dimension that holds primacy over the biological one, stating that, here quote, sex before the 17th century, in other words, was still a sociological and not an ontological category, end of the quote. So Thomas Laqueur states that around the 18th century, more or less, the reading of sexual difference was framed through the lenses of the two-sex model. Laqueur argues that this view is grounded in a radical difference between the two sexes, understood as distinct in every respect, so skeletal, nervous, and genital, for example. For Laqueur, there are two fundamental reasons for this shift, which have less to do with the scientific discoveries of the period than with an epistemological and a political motivation. On the one hand, the epistemological issue is explained by the fact that during these years, there began to emerge, though not yet explicitly, the division between sex and gender. That is, better said, a division between true and falsity, or anatomy and social theater. Moreover, during this period, the more complex views of the body were set aside in order to approach it from the immovable foundation of nature. The second issue, the political issue, is more important for Laqueur. Indeed, it likely underlies and is more radical than the epistemological one, consists in the fact that, and here the quote from Thomas Laqueur, distinct sexual anatomy was adduced to support or deny all manner of claims in a variety of specific social, economic, political, cultural, or erotic contexts. End of the quote. As already noted earlier, Laqueur assigns great importance to the power that the cultural reading of gender holds over biological sex. Indeed, even in describing the two-sex paradigm, Laqueur maintains that, although the anatomical description it prescribes claims to be absolute and a well-founded truth, he says that every reading of the body, no matter how scientifically grounded, is never neutral. but is always imbued with cultural methodologies and interpretations. So, like Judith Butler, more or less. Yet, I aim to move beyond Laqueur's framework, attending not merely to the conventional distinctions between nature and culture, or between sex and gender, but also to the symbolic dimension, a dimension that I think that Laqueur himself was implicitly gesturing toward, because he had an expansive use of the category of gender, particularly when examining the diverse ways in which bodies are interpreted and read within scientific and cultural discourses. Anyway, this is deeply connected to my choice, explained at the beginning of the presentation, to talk about sexual difference and not sex or gender difference. So this symbolic level foregrounds the ways in which meanings are ascribed to the sexed bodies, shaping not only epistemological and political understanding, but also the lived and imagined experience of being a man or a woman. So what we saw in Hegel, the woman like passive, more related to matter, and man more related to spiritual connotations. This is a reading of the body that prescribes a way to live and imagine our own body. So what I wish to argue then is broadly in line with Laqueur's proposal that at the core of the reasons leading to the emergence of a two-sex model lies the growing centrality of the body as body. However, unlike Laqueur, I maintain that this shift cannot be reduced merely to an epistemological and political reconfiguration of the body. Rather, it also reveals a symbolic transformation, one that concerns the language and imaginary through which the sexed body becomes invested with new meanings and values. This symbolic dimension, I suggest, shapes the ways in which the sexed body is taught and lived, thereby grounding the emergence of a new order of sexual difference. So now let's pass to Hegel. So, at the historical moment in which Hegel writes and lives, one can observe, not only in his work, but also in that of several contemporaries, such as Schelling, Lorenz Oken, Carl Gustav Cahus, and Joseph von Goeres, an ambiguous transition between the one-sex and the two-sex models described by Thomas Laqueur. While Laqueur analysis is primarily concerned with identifying and contrasting these two paradigms, my interest lies rather in the process of transition itself. That is, in the conceptual instability and oscillation that characterize Hegel's reflection on sexual difference and his contemporaries. In general, I sustain the Hegelian model moves really ambiguously between the two sexual models presented by Laqueur. It is not accidental, thus, that in the secondary literature engaging with this question in Hegel, we find a variety of different positions. I will just quote a few. First, there is the position that criticizes Hegel for his supposed adherence to the one-sex model. Lucy Rigaray is probably the main exponent of this position. In general, in her critique of Hegel, she laments the fact that he treats the sexes as opposite, whose opposition is resolved to a dialectical process that grants space only to the masculine, while the feminine is considered his hierarchically inferior counterpart. Within the traditional reading of Hegel that she adopts, indeed, opposition tends to be resolved harmoniously at the end and tends to generate a hierarchy. So the movement of contradiction, which should resolve the opposition dialectically, culminates in the sublation of one of the two terms within a higher unity. The result is what she calls, quote, a dialectic of a unique and solipsistic subject. This is from the book I Love to You, in which the feminine alterity is ultimately reabsorbed into the circular movement of a single male subject. So, this thesis And here I quote the book I love to use because usually people rely more on speculum of Irigaray to see her critique of Hegel, but in reality, she deals with Hegel in almost all her books, and not just critically. This thesis is also supported, albeit with different arguments, by Laura Werner, who draws on the studies of Laqueur and criticizes Hegel's inability to conceive a two-sex model. Instead, she argues, he resorts to a one-sex model, a model of opposition and hierarchy. Indeed, Werner emphasizes that, and here I quote, Hegel actually constructed sexual and gender difference as a difference within the male, since he defines sexual and gender difference as the difference between active difference and passive non-difference. So these interpretations that insist on Hegel's adherence to a one-sex model stand in contrast to, for example, Suzanne Leto's account, which places the emphasis elsewhere. For her, Hegel's reflection on sexual difference are decisively shaped by the theme of reproduction, which for him presupposes as a relation of reciprocity between the sexes. On this basis, she argues that Hegel posits what she calls an ontological dualism of the sexes. In other words, rather than subsuming woman within the logic of the male, as the one-sex model suggests, Leto's reading maintains that Hegel conceived the sexes as mutually conditioning. In this respect, her interpretation seems to align Hegel with a two-sex model, in which sexual difference is recognized as constitutive of two distinct reciprocally related sexes. There is a third position, and that is the one firstly addressed by Alison Stone, especially in their book Nature, Ethics and Gender in German Romanticism and Idealism, where she, referring to Laqueur's work, considers Hegel and Schelling as shifting between the one-sex model and the two-sex model. In general, I agree with Stone. This is my position too. Indeed, I think that Hegel seems to move between these two positions, affirming on the one hand the reality of two sexes, and on the other giving priority to the male, insofar as it is the sole bearer of spiritual attributes. And in a traditional reading of Hegel, spirit is more important than nature. Indeed, Hegel at times appears to affirm a genuine dualism of the sexes, since the reproductive process he describes presupposes sexual difference as an ontological condition of life. At other moments, however, he seems to arrange the sexes hierarchically. This tendency aligns more closely within this last tendency aligns him more closely with a one-sex model, in which man is associated with spirit, which is superior, and woman with nature, which is inferior. So, to conclude, I want to show where we can say that Hegel is addressing the one-sex model and where he's addressing the two-sex model, to show how this ambiguity takes place in his own words. So, concerning the one-sex model, the male is described by Hegel as the side of sexual difference which characterize opposition and mediation, terms connected to spirit. The female, on the contrary, is described as union and immediacy, terms which are more related to the natural world. This hierarchical structure is already implicit in the philosophy of nature, where Hegel sadly states that only the man is described as capable of full subjectivity. It becomes even more explicit, as we have seen, in the sphere of Sittlichkeit, where the man alone appears as a concrete person acting in the public realm. Also, in the sphere of Sittlichkeit, Hegel states that while the man is like an animal, so capable of subjectivity, woman is like a plant. So, quite clear what he was trying to say. Furthermore, in the Sittlichkeit, whereas the man, through his participation in public life, can also find peaceful repose within the family, says Hegel, the woman is effectively excluded from participation in the public concerns of civil society. Indeed, the woman, being closer to the element of nature, says Hegel, is not made for the higher sciences, for philosophy, and certain artistic productions which require a universal element. End of the quote. However, a more careful reading of the philosophy of nature suggests that Hegel is, at least to some extent, also working with a two-sex model. Contrary to what a purely hierarchical interpretation might claim, some passages indicate that Hegel conceives the sexes as structurally reciprocal. In this sense, the female is not simply subordinated to or derived from the male, rather there is a relation of reciprocity between them. This is particularly evident in the passage where Hegel remarks that, and he says, the prostate in the male is what corresponds to the female uterus. Here, the male organ is presented as a modification and transformation of a female structure, pointing to a mirroring relation rather than mere subordination. In this respect, Hegel can be defended against the charge of fully endorsing a one-sex model. The sexes, in this case, are conceived as mutually opposed yet jointly constitutive, and the female is not reduced to the mere negative of the male. Another important line of arguments that I think it helps to align Hegel, albeit not unambiguously, with a two-sex model, concern the complex relation between nature and spirit in his philosophy. In a traditional interpretation of Hegel, nature is understood as finally and definitively resolved in spirit. Against this reading, there are several interpreters nowadays, like Luca Letterati, Berta Maria Perez, for example, who have emphasized that spirit must continuously confront the alterity of nature, which is never fully or conclusively overcome. In this sense, nature is not simply sublated once for all, but persists as a moment that conditions, resists, and challenges spirit's self-realization. Read in this light, the dialectic between nature and spirit offers a productive framework for reconsidering sexual difference in Hegel's system. If spirit remains structurally exposed to what cannot be fully assimilated, that is nature, then the relation between woman and man, symbolically associated by Hegel to nature and spirit, cannot be reduced to a final hierarchical resolution. Instead, it points toward a persistent dualism, in which the two terms remain distinct, irreducible, and mutually implicated. I think that this reading of Hegel as a philosopher more interested in negativity, tension, and dualism as a really interesting reading of Hegel than the traditional one. And a word to conclude. Taken together, these elements shows that Hegel's account of sexual difference oscillates between a one-sex and a two-sex model. As has been shown, this oscillation places Hegel in line with many thinkers of his time, whose conceptual frameworks similarly moved between hierarchical and reciprocal understanding of sexual difference, without setting on a single coherent model. And to conclude, Hegel is really interested to the feminine figure. For example, how he treats Antigone and the phenomenology would require another meeting probably, but yes, this is it. Thank you.
We have no time for questions. Flip. Yeah.